Welcome to the Friends at Work podcast with Andrea Howard, the podcast about emotional intelligence at work. Hi, I'm Andrea Howard. With the recent Florida school shootings as the background, I talked with school psychologist Andrea Howard about the pathway to emotional healing for the families of victims and other people impacted by this horrendous act that has sadly become a regular occurrence. We also discussed how the trauma-informed training used by some schools could also be used in businesses in the light of the ME2 movement and other sensitivity issues in the workplace. Let's go now to my conversation with Andrea.
I am Andrea Howard. I am a psychologist and specifically a school psychologist, so I have lots of experience working with children, and I'm just happy to share about my experience today.
Nice. So you said you've had experience working with children. Have you always been in psychology, or is this something that you just along your career decided you wanted to go into?
Yeah, so I went to college for media communication. I thought I wanted to be a broadcast journalist.
Nice.
And changed my mind when I found out the hours that broadcast journalists work. Not even kidding. One of my professors was like, for Good Morning America, for instance, they get to the studio around 3 a.m. And I was sitting in the classroom like, this isn't the job for me.
You're like, no, I'm not even going to go there.
Exactly.
3 a.m., I like my bed too much.
Exactly. Okay. So towards the end of my senior year of college, actually, I added a psychology major as an additional thing to study just because I was interested in it, and heard about school psychology, which is something I had never heard of before I was a senior in college, and so applied for grad school right away after college. So my whole career has been in psychology or school psychology, but before then I didn't think this is where I'd be.
Interesting how something as simple as work hours can change the direction of your life.
They really can.
And in a good way. I mean, I'm sure people are like, thank God she didn't go into media, not because you would be bad at it, but because, well, there would have been something missing in psychology.
Oh, that's a very sweet way of putting it. I thought you were going to say because the media is pretty questionable.
No, not. Well, I'm in the media. I'm not questionable.
That's true. No, you're not.
I'm a good guy, and there are many good people in the media.
Yes, there are.
Yes, and you see me, or you hear me clear my throat. It's not because there's something there. I'm just trying to say, yeah, there are good people in the media, and there are other good people in the media.
That is true. No, I agree. I see your eyebrow.
Okay. All right. So it feels bad thinking about what's been going on in the news. Most recently with the Parkland, Florida shooting. And I mean, it's news, but it's not news.
Right.
My concern right now is with the kids and with the community and the families that have had to go through this shock or through this trauma. How does a community like that begin to heal? How does a school, I mean, if you were a school psychologist in that school setting, how would you begin to help to bring healing and health and hope to that community?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's very difficult. It's anyone's worst nightmare, a school shooting. But as a school psychologist, you feel personally responsible often. Just that this child was among the kids that you see and you interact with, and you missed it, and it had this impact. And for what it's worth, in the most recent shooting, it sounds like he wasn't really missed. In fact, he had a lot of school services and mental health services outside of school. Yeah. So it wasn't that he was missed. It was just that he was still violent. And maybe it didn't rise to the level of service that he needed. But as far as how we can help to heal, I will say the human spirit is remarkably resilient. And you could read a million stories, if you want to do online, of terrible things that have happened in the last 10 days, right? Not just the school shooting, but anywhere around the world. And the fact is that humans are able to heal from these things and come out of it stronger and come out of it more unified. And I think we're seeing that right now amongst our teenagers across the country, and especially in Florida, that they are taking a real active role in how can we come back from this? How can our community strengthen? How can we as kids have more of an impact? I saw a comparison today to the teenagers that made such a difference during the during the civil rights movement, and the teenagers that we have now, embodying them to say, you can make a difference no matter how young you are.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a wonderful side effect that can come out of this. But if I was in this school and I was trying to deal with it day by day, the hard thing is, as an adult in that school, you're also traumatized. You're affected on a very deep level. And so what often happens in schools is sort of an all call. Every psychologist, counselor, guidance counselor in the area will come to schools and set up, oftentimes like in the gym or something, tables all the way around the outside of the gym, and every kid can just cycle in and talk to anyone at any time. And at that point, you're doing triage. You're looking for kids who may have been impacted by this violence and wanted to carry out violence themselves. You're looking for kids who may feel suicidal or whose grief has reached an unbearable level. You're looking for kids who are triggered just by walking back into the school building and aren't able to function day by day. So the fact that you're in that triage mindset makes it really hard for you to think preventatively, to think, how can we improve this going forward and long term? So it often does take lots of time before you're able to move past triaging situations and move into, okay, it's been, let's say, 6 months. No one's forgotten about it. How do we heal, and how do we move forward in a productive way? It's really difficult. And I think one other point that you made early when you were talking that is important is that this isn't new. Mm-hmm. It's news, but it's not new. And so now there are communities where parents who've lost their children in school shootings, teachers who've lost their students, etc., or students who've lost their friends can talk to others who've been through it, can be impacted by others who've faced this before. So while it's a tragedy that it's become so widespread in our culture, you're not alone anymore in it. When Columbine happened, it seemed like this has never happened before. Yeah. This will never happen again. How do we help these people? This is impossible. And now, I mean, it's a sad fact, but also hopeful. There's community. There's somewhere to turn. There's someone who knows what you're going through.
Kind of like support groups.
Exactly. And so that's sort of a strength if you can tap into that. And then I think it's important to also note that it's not just Florida that's mourning. You know, all teenagers or even preteens or children who walked into school the next day were scared and may be scared going forward for a long time. And so all school personnel, I'm sure, across the country the day after the shooting walked in with an attitude of, anyone needs to talk, you can come talk. We're supportive of you guys and we're here for you.
And thank you for that answer. I think it kind of like gave a broad overview of what is done in that kind of situation and some of the access to help that people can get. But you also mentioned preventative measures. How does a school counselor begin to identify a troubled student in this situation? Because there have been way too many. I read a comment somewhere. Someone mentioned that this kid could not buy alcohol, but had the right to buy a war machine and could kill people. And he had those guns legally. And so, in spite of the larger picture of the rather confusing legal system around weapons, how does a school psychologist identify someone of this nature and help?
Mm-hmm. So I'll start technical since you gave me permission.
Please do.
and broadly, and then I'll get more narrow as we go. But so we work in a new philosophy in education called MultiTiered systems of support.
Okay.
And it was basically born out of a public health model of how to do preventative science in the real world.
Okay.
And so we start at what we call Tier 1. Tier 1 is every single student that you see in a school building or in a district. And at the Tier 1 level, you can put interventions in place that reach everyone, regardless of how much they're at risk for this type of violence. And then we move to Tier 2, which are targeted interventions for groups that we consider at risk. And I could talk about how we find those kids. And then at Tier 3, we're talking about an identified concern that already exists. So it might be a child that already has a disability. It might be a person who's already threatening violence. Whatever it is, you're at the most severe level of need now. And we have a different level of intervention at that level. So we're doing prevention in that we look at where students fall on we make it look like a pyramid, really, how they fall in this pyramid. And then we compare that to what interventions we can give. So I was working in a school district in Pittsburgh about a year and a half ago. And we were doing this with suicide prevention. Suicide prevention and school shootings have some similarities because the media, or not even media, but just the frenzy that can build up around those kind of events often leads to contagion. So if you see a suicide in a high school, you might end up seeing a few more suicides if you handle it a certain way. And same with school violence. Even I was reading today, since the Florida shooting, there have been multiple instances of kids with guns in schools, including in Maryland, in the county that we're in right now.
Wow.
And so there's a contagion factor here. Kids who are already violent or are prone to violence and who are feeling victimized in some way, maybe seeing this and thinking this is the way to go. You know, look at the prestige that this man rose to already. Everyone knows his name. So we want to work on all these levels, but in Pittsburgh, where we were working on suicide, at Tier 1, we're just talking to every teacher, including cafeteria staff, including janitors, including school secretaries, everyone who works inside a school building, and teaching them the warning signs and the risk factors. And there are some, warning signs of suicide specifically, and even of school violence that people don't expect. For instance, if your mood suddenly improves, that could be a bad sign. If you've been depressed for a long time and your mood suddenly improves, that could be a sign that you may be planning to kill yourself.
Ooh, wow.
So there's some of these warning signs aren't clear cut, and others that people think are a warning sign, like someone cutting themselves, are often not warning signs. And so we try to dispel some of those myths, but also to encourage all the staff that you may see something, you may hear something, and here's who you're going to report it to right away. We look for things like violent themes in kids' writings, or if you see a note on the ground, if you hear a kid, overhear someone saying something to his friend or showing something in a backpack, see it, say it. And at least we can intervene before it becomes a violent situation. So at Tier 1, we also are recruiting the kids themselves. You guys are on the ground. You're here with all your friends. Let's teach you about mental health. We'll teach you about stress. We'll also teach you about the warning signs and the risk factors that are associated with violence towards yourself or others. And kids are pretty good at seeing it in other children. Even if you're young, even if you're middle school or 5th grade or 4th grade, you notice when something's off. And so we just encourage that, share that information with an adult and make sure you know which adults you trust. Even if it's the cafeteria lady, we'll take it. At Tier 2, now we're talking about how we use screening measures to find these kids who are at risk. So we have social emotional screeners, perhaps, that we do it across the whole class or across the whole school. Also, if a child is brought up to our attention enough times, we might move them into a Tier 2 kind of setting where now this child we're targeting them because they're at risk.
Yeah.
They're not already violent, but there's a chance that they're going to rise to that violence. So we're going to target them. We're going to have social skills groups. We're going to have individual counseling offered to that child. We're going to work with the teachers on whatever trauma history that child has experienced themselves and how to not re-traumatize that student in your classroom. And we're going to work with the family to say what's happening in your life at home. Do you need help? Do you need resources? And you can hear as I'm talking about this is a lot of work, considering that most of this is kind of outside the purview of what school psychologists have to do by law. Okay. Which is just evaluations. And so to put all this effort in, a school has to be very progressive in its mindset of how best to serve students. And then we get to Tier 3. In Tier 3, we're talking individualized supports for one child who's past being at risk and is now fully a risk. He is or she is obviously standing in front of you. Things are not good. What do you do? And school psychologists probably have different philosophies on how to handle this, but in essence, we do something called a threat assessment. How serious is it that this is going to happen today? In the case of suicide, we ask questions like, are you going to kill yourself? How are you going to do it? And which is a little counterintuitive too, because some people think you're not supposed to ask.
I would have thought that was that would be counterintuitive.
Right. But we ask, because if a child's response is something like, oh, I'm going to swallow a bunch of pills, and then we say, oh, where are you going to get the pills? And they don't know, then we know that they haven't thought it through far enough to act on this, and they're children, right? So we are taking into account their cognitive development and the fact that they may, if they haven't thought up a plan and the plan isn't realistic to kill them, then, we know that they're not at the point of, going to die that night. We still wrap around, we still consider, do we need to admit this person to the hospital? Do we need to call these parents? Does the ambulance need to come and take them away? How are we going to make sure this child's safe from tonight until tomorrow? And when it comes to violence, the problem is these things are much more gradual. Okay. So suicide, you're leading up to it. When it's kind of coming to a head. Hopefully someone hears something and that child is sent to your office right away. With violence, you might have been talking about a lifetime of being alone or an outcast, bullied, etc. You might have a bunch of trauma in your own family, mental health history of your own, and we're sort of all on the edge. Like, is this person going to snap? Yeah. But how do you know when it's going to come, right? Because usually that outcast doesn't have that many people they can tell that they're going to be violent to. So it's a very difficult situation. And there are specific tools for threat assessment that you can buy, like assessments that you can give that are standardized, and so they compare a child to every other child their age across the country, and possibly could get more specific as far as what that kid needs. But to some extent, if you're the professional in the building and you aren't sure, there's nowhere else you can turn, and you have to make a decision. Are you going to go intensive and do everything just in case, or are you just going to sort of let it ride out and be awake all night, which is what school psychologists end up doing. Just can't go to sleep because you sent a kid home and you don't know what's going to happen, and you come in the next day running to their first period to make sure they're there.
Nobody thinks about. I mean, I wouldn't have thought about that. That's that traumatizing for the psychologist.
It's very traumatizing. The times I've had to have this conversation, and now that I'm in a private practice, things are a little bit different because I have more access to parents all the time, and I'm working through the parent for the kids, so I can call them at midnight if I needed to. Yeah. When you're in a school, you're sort of chained to those school hours, it feels like, and so you just worry. You worry all night long that you may have made the wrong choice or what's going to happen, and you just can't wait for the kid to show up the next day to ensure that you didn't make the wrong decision. It's stressful.
Yeah, that sounds really stressful.
Yeah.
And you talked about a lot of things, and thanks for that, explaining the 3 tiers. You talked about re-traumatizing a kid. Can you explain that?
Sure. So there's a new push in, not that new, but it's really picking up steam now in all of psychology, called trauma-informed care. Okay. And very popular for people to be getting certified in this right now. Okay. And so the concept is that if someone has experienced a trauma of any sort at some point in their life, and then they are re-traumatized even accidentally by an adult, they're going to act out, right? So it might be acting out in a way that's behavioral. It might be emotional, whatever the difficulty is. So for instance, I work a lot with kids with autism. That's one of my specialties. And we end up doing restraints from time to time. We're not holding the child down on the ground, but we might have like a hand out to block something, or if they're banging their head against the wall, we might have some sort of, hold so that their head isn't smacking the wall, whatever it is. But if a child has been abused physically in the past, and you're laying your hands on a child, even in a positive way, even in a, pat on the back or a rub or let me protect your head so you don't get hurt, it can re-traumatize. It can bring up those feelings of that trauma again. And then that kid may be acting out of a way that's you're just adding insult to injury in essence. Wow. And so in schools, we talk to teachers about, you don't know which of the children in your classroom were verbally abused all night long. And if they come in here and sit down and you start yelling to get their pencils out and get their paper out, and your voice is harsh and your tone is strong, you may actually be traumatizing them again, triggering that experience of the trauma they experienced, and you're not going to get anywhere, And so you have to know your kids really well. You have to understand what they've truly experienced, and those things can be hard to find out, especially depending on the age and ability level of the kid. But it's a big push in schools that will find ways to identify what triggers and stressors this child is already facing and find ways to not add to it.
Wow. So teachers being certified for this also, or is this just...
Yeah, there's a push for trauma-informed schools.
Okay.
It's sort of a new initiative, and I don't know that much about it, but the idea is that all teachers and staff and administrators are trained in these kind of trauma-informed care to make sure that you're not adding to the problem and you're actually creating solutions instead. I think that's a little slower to gain steam for the same reason I said earlier that these teachers are also expected to do X, Y, Z, A, B, C, D, E.
Exactly.
And so are the administrators. And so it's not quite as much of a push. School psychologists get that mental health side of things, and so they're more likely to get the certification. But even just clinical psychologists are still working on this trauma-informed care model and how to get ourselves, certified, get social workers certified, etc.
With what you talked about, I feel like this sort of training should also be given in work environments where staff learn to assess or be more sensitive to the feelings or to the challenges people bring to work.
Yeah, that's right. And that is an experience I'm having currently in my job on top of all of this trauma issue with just the different cultural backgrounds of my coworkers. We're a very diverse office. And so I have coworkers who don't want to be touched at all. And I have coworkers who are like, you come in every morning and they hug you. Even though you saw them yesterday, and so it's learning the balance of those. For someone who doesn't have a trauma history with touch, they might be willing to be like, okay, in this situation, I'm going to hug you. And in this situation, I'm not going to hug you. But for other people in any office or in any situation where people are, there's going to be someone who's been traumatized.
True.
By something.
Yes.
And likely everyone is experiencing some version of trauma in their own lives. And so that's a really important observation. And in the mental health field, if you work with people in the mental health field, I think you're doubly at risk of this because clients' issues can mirror your own life experiences. And so if a person comes to you and they've had experience with a sexual assault, let's say, and they come to you for counseling and they want support with it, and this is something you've experienced or a friend of yours has experienced, which is a guarantee with the prevalence of it, unfortunately, it can trigger you and it can add, problems for you professionally, but also in a coworker context, because then your coworkers are talking about so-and-so and whatever happened to them, and you're thinking in your mind, oh, this happened to me, or this happened to someone I know. And so it's even harder. It's easy to be triggered when you're hearing people's deep, dark struggles and the traumas they've experienced. Wow. Yeah, that's a good observation, though. You're right.
Because I've also heard, especially with what's this training that everybody has to do now with sensitivity training, anti-harassment training, and all of that that's going on in the offices. From my experience and what I've seen around is that a lot of people, and when an issue like this, especially with the ME2 movement and other things going on around the feminist movement generally, it becomes so focal that even issues that are not necessarily sexual can be interpreted that way because that's the focus at this time. That's true. And one of the things, it's one of the reasons why I kind of like latched onto the idea of trauma, because I can understand from a trauma perspective a woman who's been catcalled, who's been even probably harassed on different levels by people outside the work environment, or even just generally in the course of life, coming into a work environment, and someone who has no background with that, or even has no intention to be sexual in any way, does something that she interprets that way. Right. It could look that way. But if, from the perspective of trauma training, coworkers are more sensitive to say, well, I don't know, because the situation doesn't necessarily have to be sexual to be traumatic.
Right. Exactly.
And when you think about sexual harassment, it's it's in my mind, and you're the expert, it seems like a subset of trauma.
It is, right.
And so I think the larger training, or the larger, probably more balanced training in my mind, would be trauma training, to be able to say, this person doesn't like such and such, not because all women don't like it, or because it's immoral or unethical, but to this person, and out of respect to this person, you also must pay attention to that. To this person, this is, you don't do this.
Right.
Because I feel like we're getting to a point, and I've seen this reports from several organizations where we're beginning to, there's this level of dehumanization, or that I feel is happening, where people who would ordinarily be let me switch to, when you talk about the 5 love languages,
right.
which is not necessarily which don't always function in a romantic context.
Exactly. Yeah.
That people who naturally are communicative cannot say, are not allowed to talk to people anymore, because even though they don't say bad things, you may say something that may tick someone off, and then you're reported to HR. Or people who are naturally physical, who will, in whatever context you find them, they would hug you, shake your hands vigorously. Those kind of personalities, I feel like in many organizations, are being hampered, because they're just saying, look, don't be yourself at work. These are the parameters. Once you work within these parameters, you're fine. But I feel like we're losing we're losing a lot by just making everything a flat chart. Let's say this is how all women are, this is how all men are, and this is how they must interact. That's not how real life is. It's not. You have kids and they all have different personalities.
Right.
And so you cannot relate with one person as you would with the other and expect to get consistent results. So I feel like if the trend that I'm noticing in HR practice, for instance, continues, a lot of organizations are going to lose out on the dynamism and the productivity that they could have when people bring their whole self to work, but are aware to be respectful of other people's preferences. So that's just
right.
Yeah,
I'm with you on that. I think there are 2 kind of themes that came up as you were talking. One is that this requires vulnerability. So for anyone to say, oh, I was traumatized, let's say sexually, I have sexual trauma in my past, so please don't hug me. It's a horrifying thing to say to your coworker if you don't have a close relationship built on trust, and if you don't allow that vulnerability. But then on top of that, as individuals, I think we all have to be less defensive, because let's say, so I am more physical, I think, than some of my coworkers.
Okay.
I'm more willing to rub a back or give someone a hug or whatever. And so if someone said to me, I don't like that, I hope that I would be able to say, oh, I'm sorry. I won't do that anymore. I understand.
But I totally respect that. Interestingly, my personality is very similar to yours in that regard. And I have had people tell me, I have a friend that we've been friends now for, I don't know, almost 3 decades. And I remember almost 20 years ago, where I gave him a side hug, and he was just like, don't touch me. Don't touch me. And from that day, no.
Right.
Just out of respect for, I don't know why he said that. I don't know what the way that's, but hey, it's etched in my mind. If I hug, if he's on a row of 5 people that I'm greeting and I hug 4 people and I get to him, I'm going to skip him. It's like, I'm going to reach out a hand to him and give him a handshake.
Right.
But I do understand that not everybody necessarily, is this vulnerable or respectful of other people's preferences. But I think that's, but I suspect that's the balance that we need to try and get, rather than these rules where we want to legislate ethical change,
Right.
which is pretty difficult
Yeah, I
in when
agree.
in how it plays out.
I think that, you know, as you're talking, I mean, this is kind of my first time thinking about this in a coworker sense, but I'm with you on this. I think if you consider that the new rule in your company is don't touch anyone, for instance, no physical touch at all to your coworkers. If you have a close friendship or close work relationship with someone and there are opportunities where touch would be welcomed, I think
And appropriate.
exactly. I think you're cutting down on those relationships that can help people love their jobs and flourish in their jobs. There are plenty of tragic things that I experience at work, tragic stories that I hear from kids, tragic situations with families, whatever the case may be. And when I come out of one of those difficult things, I kind of need the support of one of my coworkers because I can't really share that information with anyone outside my organization. And if one of my coworkers in that situation gives me a side hug or pats me on the back or something, it signals to me things are okay, you did a good job, and so as a person who likes to receive that kind of touch, I would be sad to work somewhere where that's eliminated or ruled out as a rule instead of taken into account individuals. And
Yeah.
and I think it is easier to have this conversation around culture because people aren't as ashamed of their culture as they are of their trauma history. The fact is that the traumatic things that have happened to people are not their own fault.
Yeah.
And so we need to shift as a society towards thinking of someone's trauma as not a judgment on them at all. And unfortunately, we're still there. So if someone tells you they've been sexually assaulted at a club in college, you immediately have an image in your mind of what this person is like. And so we need to get away from that. We need to change that in our society and move more towards an open, understanding, individualistic, take each person's experience as their own and don't try to impose your experience onto them.
Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense.
Easier said than done.
Yeah.
I think it is.
But with everything that's happening, for instance, the Me2 movement is easier said than done, but it's beginning to have impact.
It really is.
But for someone like me, until Harvey Weinstein, I didn't even know it was a thing. Like, it's actually been on for a decade.
Yeah.
And so it's in the same vein. If this becomes, something enough people care enough about, it could be a cultural shift also. Because I'm really the kind of person that I don't like this punitive, almost vengeful mindset that comes about when when you've been oppressed and you want to get back up. It's like it gets to a point where you can go overboard and almost you can miss the whole point of why it started in the first place. And that's the challenge, to find a middle ground, not to deny that the problem does not exist, or not even for many men who think they understand how traumatic it is, and who just say, I understand. We really don't understand.
Right.
But to also acknowledge that we don't understand enough, but there has to be a middle ground with these things. And I feel like when we try and acknowledge each other and express ourselves fully and positively, that's when we learn and grow. One of the things I feel like with this new rules in HR is that there is no room to correct. It's like you make a mistake and you're out in some organizations, and nobody. It seems that people are not even looking at intent; they just look at action.
Right.
And sometimes people mistakenly do something, and you actually do. If you look at intent, you're like, that's not it. I'll give you an example. I was talking with a friend. This was not a work situation, thank God. But I was speaking with a friend the other time, and I used the word. I was talking about somebody who had a disability,
Mm-hmm.
and I said they were deaf and dumb.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there was no malicious intent in using the word dumb, but thank God this person was sensitive and also kind and looked at me, and I was like, and the way they looked at me, and they didn't quite say anything, and they just like, did you mean mute?
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that, oh, that's the American way to say it.
Mm-hmm.
But I speak English also, and
Right.
the way English is spoken in my home country is different. We would say deaf and dumb, and nobody will feel offended. Even
Right.
the person who has this disability will not be offended. But in a hypersensitive American society, if I was a public figure, or I'd said that in a public setting, people might have jumped on me and said, look at this guy who said, and without trying to understand my background or even knowing what I intended to say. And so there's no correction. I'm talking about the extreme now, which seems to be happening more often. People just jump on you and say, you shouldn't have said that. But I was open to correction. Immediately, I was corrected. Even though sometimes my natural inclination is to go straight to say the word dumb, but I'm like, oh, mute. So I correct my because that correction has been in my mind.
Right.
And if tomorrow somebody says it's a different way, it's a different way. But I had to have made that mistake first to be corrected.
Right.
And so this fear of I don't want to be wrong, which I sense happens both in the larger society, but much more in many work environments. I feel it's disturbing. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, you're right. I think that story you just told, though, highlights the importance of relationships. So we only grow through relationships. It's hard to grow as an independent person without any people around you.
Yeah.
Right? And so you were I don't know the whole background of this story that you're telling, but clearly this person knew you well enough to not assume that you were making a comment that was hurtful and on purpose.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
And so I think in the work situation, that's how this extends. How do you form relationships with your coworkers in a way that opens up the floor to these kinds of conversations? And so in the organization I work in, I'm one of the very few white people. And which is wonderful because the clientele we serve is mostly not white. And so I think that's very important that we have that. But also it has provided me opportunities to ask some of my coworkers things to help me clarify, am I making a faux pas here? Am I saying something that's hurtful here? Is this crossing a line that I don't know about? But because we are already friends, they already trust that I'm not, acting in a way that's purposefully racist or prejudiced or in any way, right? So because we have that relationship already, I can say things to them like, hey, can I ask you a question? This is what I heard. Is that an okay way to approach this? And then they're honest with me.
Yeah.
And if they're honest in a way that kind of hurts my feelings and says like, I can't believe you would think that, I need to be the bigger person who can say like, okay, well then now I know.
Yeah.
Thanks for informing me. I will make sure to make that change. And so it's a vulnerable position to be in on either side.
Yes.
Whether you're the person who has to correct someone and say like, that is offensive or that is too far or what you did there touching me or whatever. Whether you're that person or the other person who has to be corrected and have the grace to accept the correction and understand it without adding a judgment about that person. It is difficult to do, but you need to be in relationships, first of all, and in relationships with people who are different than you.
Yeah.
If you look around at your circle of friends and your family and your coworkers and they all look and act exactly like you and they're from backgrounds that are similar to you, it's hard to grow.
Yeah, true.
So you need to get out of that comfort zone and embrace relationships across barriers of all types, and I think gender is one of those that we as a society feel weird about, cross-gender relationships for some reason, which I don't quite understand. But it's back to this hypersensitivity, like, oh no, she's having lunch with a man. What does this mean?
Yeah.
But you need those relationships. So if you're even just surrounded by people of the same gender as you, and you don't have anyone you can honestly talk to of the opposite gender, then there's at least 50% of the population out there that you could be offending on a daily basis.
True.
And individuals within that group, even more so. So I do think if we can build our workplaces to be more purposefully diverse, to allow more cross-team types of collaboration and improve all of those types of communication, then we're on the right track. It does seem like the more those types of things happen, the more these problems pop up. But that's why, because we weren't having these conversations before when we were all in our own bubbles.
True.
And now that we're not in our own bubbles and we're seeing the truth for what it is, we're going to have hard conversations.
Yeah. And the idea that I tend to see with almost anything, the school shooting, Me Too, is almost always reactive, not proactive. And you talked about prevention. But how do you think managers or employers could proactively create an environment that fosters this kind of relationships that we've talked about? How do you create this kind of relationship that gives trust, that enhances the quality of service?
That is a loaded question. So as a side that I didn't mention previously in this conversation, I'm a behavioral psychologist. So my philosophy on psychology is behavioral, meaning that behavior is deterministic and we act in a way that makes sense in our environment, etc. And so being a behavioral psychologist, and especially working a lot with children with autism, we focus in my field on decreasing problem behaviors, decreasing challenging behaviors. So you could think of the things you're describing as problem behaviors.
Okay.
Right. And so we want to bring those things down. We want to bring down sexual assault. We want to bring down sexual harassment. We want to bring down instances of triggering people who've experienced trauma. We want to bring down racism and prejudice, right? Those are the things we want to decrease. But in my field, the way we do that with a child with autism, if they're banging their head or screaming or aggressive or whatever the case may be, is by increasing other skills. So we never just try to remove the bad things. We always try to increase something good in its place. And in autism specifically, and just in behavioral psychology, we try to replace that behavior with something that can get you the same outcome in a more appropriate way.
Okay.
So if we're talking about sexual harassment, we don't want to just, like you said, react to it and try to make it go away by shaming people and putting them on blast and typing them all over Twitter and whatever the case may be, though that seems to be helpful right now on a societal level. But we also want to be increasing skills. So what are the skills that this person is lacking? Is it that they're lacking the patience to listen to the people around them? Is it that they don't understand how to interact appropriately with someone of the opposite sex? Is it that they don't know where the line is? Is it that they don't know that they're offending people, right? And so what is the deficit? What is the skill that's lacking there, and how can we teach it? In a business setting, and I equate it to similar to how we do this with teachers, we talk about, look for what you know and what you don't know. Be aware enough of yourself to say, I know how to handle this and I don't know how to handle that. And if there's something that you don't know, instead of pretending like you do and pretending like you can handle it on your own, ask someone for help. Search out an answer. Try some research on your own if you feel so inclined, but ask someone who is really good at that. So you see another manager who has great relationships with his managees, talk to him and say, where did you learn these skills, and what do you think works best for you? And, have that conversation. And then I think one factor that's really missing right now in leadership in this country and potentially in a lot of corporations and schools, etc., is modeling by the leadership. You want to see your leaders acting the way that they want to trickle down to everyone that their organization touches. In schools, if you have a kind of a bully principal, which happens, and they bully the assistant principals, and then they bully the school psychologist, and then they bully the teachers, and it kind of trickles down to the kids. And you're teaching the kids, this is how you interact with other people. Same in an organization or a company. If you're a manager and you treat your people with respect, and you're respectful when they correct you, and you leave room in your life for those kinds of relationships, that you take that feedback well, then you're modeling for your organization. This is how we act here, setting a standard that's realistic and also positive. So it's a little hairy because expecting people to be self-aware, expecting people to care about these things, doesn't always work out well, right? I mean, I could think of a lot of cases where I just wish someone would just realize that what they're doing is hurting other people, but they don't see that, and they're closed off to that. And I think one thing that I've learned from some of my coworkers and some of the conversations I've had is just that as a white person, even as a woman, I do have the privilege of talking to some people who wouldn't talk to others about this type of thing. True. So if another white person comes and talks to me in a way that's racist towards someone else, I have the privilege of being in that room with them, and I have the privilege of being, quote unquote, on their level, and I can talk back, and I can engage, and I can ask questions and dig deeper, kind of like your friend did for you, and just say, did you mean this? Yeah. Or do you want to say this? And give those gentle but pointed remarks like, I think this is what you're trying to say. Or in times I have the freedom to, explode. Yeah. And say, that's ridiculous. You can't say that. You can't act that way. And so to see your privilege, to see the situations you're in where you have some sort of ability to speak some truth into someone else, and then not to let those pass by, because really what you're doing is helping your fellow person. Yeah, kind of like you never know moments. Exactly. You never know how this is going to work out down the road. If you figure out how to make this work, every school district in America will buy it from you. It's hard. It's hard.
I believe so. I mean, if it wasn't, I guess it would be done already. But
right.
I feel it's an ideal to try and shoot for. It stresses me out just thinking about it
it does me too. And yet, this is one of the beauties of working with children. You get a lot of hope for humanity day in and day out when you work with kids. I don't think it's necessarily new, but I think we're noticing it now. Children don't have the same filters that adults have. Children don't read the social cues and react the way they're, quote unquote, supposed to react. They are gut instinct, human beings, unfiltered, wonderful little things. And so I constantly have conversations with children and teenagers where they might say something in a way that maybe they should word it differently, but often I'm amazed at their hearts and their hopefulness and their optimism. And I think we can, by changing some of our societal practices and admitting as adults that we don't have it right, we can kind of increase that in the next generation. And that's happening a lot right now with the consent kind of conversation. So the way to prevent sexual harassment is to increase understanding of consent. Yeah. Right? It's to teach all people what it means when someone wants to have a conversation with you, doesn't want to have a conversation with you, how to read social cues, how to read nonverbal cues, that kind of thing, and how to ask very directly for what you want and for what you're looking for, so that you're not confusing anyone with, innuendo or being kind of backdoor about it and not actually coming straight out. And so that work is happening in middle schools and high schools. And it's interesting and a little bit scary, but at the same time, with the MeToo movement, with all of the media coverage of some kind of terrible but powerful men who have really been exposed as of recent, I think there has been a shift. Yeah. So you can see it when you're in these classrooms. You can hear kids talking about this, and they're understanding it a lot better than I did as a kid. The word consent is not something I was ever taught to me. Interesting. I didn't know what it meant. Until I was old enough to read things for myself. Exactly. So we're going in the right direction, but it kind of feels like while the sexual harassment types of culture are hitting their moment right now, there's a lot of things that have risen to that level. There's a lot of issues in our society that are really out there right now, and that everyone knows are issues. and how do you intervene on 5,000 things at once? You know,
True.
it's difficult.
It's difficult. True. Yeah. I mean, you pick your battles, as they say,
Right.
one at a time.
Right.
On that note, we've come to the end of this conversation. I really, really appreciate your insights. It's been a wonderful, lovely conversation with you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode. You can reach me by email at myfriendtoye@gmail.com. Check out my Facebook page at Friends at Work Podcast. And follow me on Twitter at Friends at Work US. Join me next time for another episode of Friends at Work Podcast with Ade Toye. Bye for now.